The limestone rises on either side before anything else is visible. Two walls of pale rock climbing sheer and close, their faces catching the afternoon light and holding it in that particular way of stone that has stood long enough to seem less like geology and more like intention. The air between them is cooler than the air left behind below. It drops noticeably as the path moves deeper into their shadow, the way temperature changes when a door is opened onto a room that has been closed a long time. And somewhere ahead, before the water itself comes into view, there is the sound of it, a low, steady rush filling the narrow space between the cliffs, present in the rock underfoot as much as in the ears, the sound of the Castalian spring moving through its gorge as it has moved for longer than anyone who has ever paused here to listen could measure. This is the approach to Delphi, not from the sea road, where pilgrims from the south would have come up through the olive groves with the Gulf of Corinth at their backs, its surface going flat and silver in the afternoon haze far below. Not from the mountain passes to the north, where the road comes down out of the high country, and the sanctuary appears first as a suggestion of rooftops and terrace walls against the cliff face. This is the approach through the gorge itself, between the Phaedriades, the shining rocks, as the ancient world called them, the two great limestone cliffs that frame the sanctuary from above. To enter through their shadow is to arrive at one of the most particular places in the ancient world, a place that was sacred long before anyone fully understood why it should be, and that held its character as a sacred place with remarkable persistence through centuries of change, across the transitions of gods and cults, and conquerors and empires. The character of the site remaining essentially unchanged beneath everything that happened to it. The Phaedriades take their name from the way they behave in light. On a clear afternoon, the sun striking the pale limestone of their upper faces creates a brightness that is visible from considerable distance, a reflected light that throws itself outward and downward across the valley, toward the Gulf of Corinth, making the cliffs seem to generate illumination rather than merely receive it. They are not the tallest cliffs in Greece, but positioned as they are, above a south-facing terrace at roughly 570 meters above sea level, they work with the landscape in a specific way, concentrating the afternoon light, holding it, releasing it in long slanting directions across a valley that opens wide toward the coast. Those who saw them for the first time from the path below described something closer to a visual event than a landform. The light from the Phaedriades arriving at the eyes of the traveler still some distance from the sanctuary, saying something about the place before the place itself was reached. Between those cliffs, the Castalian spring. It emerges from a deep, narrow gorge cut back into the rock, the water cold in all seasons, moving with the particular steadiness of a spring that draws from deep underground, its source not dependent on rain or snowmelt in the way that surface streams are. The sound is the first thing. The path arrives within range of it before the gorge itself opens up, the water audible in the walls of rock around it, the rushing sound filling the air and softening the edges of everything else. Then the spring itself, not wide, not dramatic in its physical form, but specific in its quality, the water clear over pale stone, the air above it carrying a coolness and a faint smell of something mineral and clean. In the ancient world, this water was understood to have properties that no other water had, not miraculous in any crude sense, but distinct, particular, belonging to this place in a way that could not be separated from what this place was. Plutarch, who knew Delphi better than almost any other writer whose work survives, served as a priest at the sanctuary during the late 1st and early 2nd centuries of the Common Era, and he wrote about the Castalian spring, with the attention of someone who had sat beside it for years. He described the smell of the water, he noted its clarity, and he situated it within a broader account of what the place itself did, what it produced in those who came to it. Prepared, what the landscape and the air and the qualities of the site contributed to the experience of the sacred there. For Plutarch, the spring was inseparable from the oracle. The water was not incidental to the ritual. Purification in the Castalian spring was required before any engagement with the sanctuary could take place, required of the Pythia, the sacred woman who would receive and deliver the oracle's pronouncements, and required of every pilgrim who came to consult her. Whatever the consultation held, whatever question brought the traveler up through the olive groves or down through the mountain passes, it began here, at the spring, with the cold water and the sound of it, and the specific sensation of arriving at a threshold that had been in use since before memory extended. The region is Phocis, central Greece, the area that ancient sources identified as the navel of the earth, the omphalos, the center around which everything else was organized. The claim is not geographic in any measurable modern sense, but it was understood as a cosmological fact, a statement about the structure of the world rather than the configuration of the landscape. The sanctuary at Delphi occupied a position in the ancient Greek imagination that had less to do with its physical location and more to do with what the site was understood to be, a point of contact between the world that human beings inhabited and the deeper, older order that underlay it, a place where the surface of things grew thin, where the boundary between what was visible and what was otherwise could be crossed, at least in one direction, at least in the specific context of the oracle, at least by those who came correctly prepared. The goddess Themis held the oracle before Apollo came to it. This is the tradition as the ancient world largely understood it, not as mythology invented after the fact to explain a transition, but as a genuine account of the site's sacred history, a history that included divine tenets before the one most famous to us. Themis, the personification of divine law, of the right ordering of things, of the ancient principles by which the cosmos was organized, rather than merely governed. The law she represented was not the law of kings or cities. It was the law that preceded kings and cities, the law that made them possible, the order in which things were properly arranged before human beings added their particular complications. Aeschylus, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, placed Themis at Delphi before Apollo in his tragedy, the Eumenides, part of the Aristeia trilogy, presenting her presence there, not as an aberration, but as the natural condition of a site whose sacred character preceded the current Olympian order. The oracle at Delphi was old before Apollo claimed it. The site's connection to prophecy and to divine contact was older than the god most associated with it. And before Themis, in the same ancient tradition, Gaia, the primordial earth goddess, the first and foundational being of the Greek cosmological account, the ground itself, given form and divine character, the mother of the oldest divine generations, the body out of which everything that existed had eventually emerged. The oracle at Delphi belonged to Gaia before it belonged to Themis before it belonged to Apollo, and the sequence matters, not as a competitive claim about which deity had the better right, but as a description of what the place was understood to be. The site's sacred character did not originate with the god most prominently associated with it. It originated with the earth itself, with the primordial ground, with the deep forces that moved beneath the rock, long before the Olympian order was established, or any particular god claimed this terrace on the slope of Parnassus as his own. The oracle was ancient before it had a name. The pneuma rising from the chasm in the earth beneath the innermost chamber of the temple was there before the temple was built around it. The pneuma, Plutarch wrote about this as well, the sweet-smelling breath, the exhalation from below, the scent that had no obvious earthly source, rising from the fissure in the floor of the Adyton, the innermost chamber of the sanctuary. The word itself means breath, or wind, or the animating substance that moved through things and gave them life in the way the ancient Greek traditions understood life to work. What Plutarch described was physical, a smell, a presence in the air, something detectable by the senses of the person who entered that interior room. He connected it to the divine character of the site, to the presence of the god, to the quality that made Delphi different from other places. He was a careful and widely read man, Plutarch, trained in philosophy as well as theology, attentive to the distinction between what the tradition said and what observation suggested. And what he recorded was this: beneath the innermost floor of the temple of Apollo, along a crack in the ancient rock, something rose from below, a breath of the earth, something the place had been exhaling for longer than anyone could say. The sanctuary is built on a terrace that was not made by human hands. The natural shelf of rock on the southwestern slope of Parnassus created a level surface above the valley, below the cliffs, positioned in the precise relationship to light and altitude and geography that the site required. Later construction, centuries of it, layered temples and treasuries and colonnades and votive monuments across that original surface, until the terrace became a dense topography of sacred architecture. But beneath all of it, the original landscape persisted. The rock of Parnassus ran beneath the floors of the later buildings, the same rock that the first people to recognize this place as sacred had stood on, the same fissures through which the same breath had risen in whatever time that was. The archaeology reaches down through layers of construction and rebuilding and finds, at increasing depth, the evidence of an older occupation, an older recognition of the site's character. The Mycenaean period, roughly 1500 to 1100 years before the Common Era, left behind pottery and terracotta figurines and the physical traces of settlement in and around the Delphic site. Among the objects recovered in excavation was a small female figurine, Mycenaean in manufacture, the clay worn smooth, the figure's arms raised in a posture that scholars have read as devotional, as an attitude of prayer or invocation. The interpretation is argued, as these interpretations always are. The function of Mycenaean figurines is not settled, and any claim about what a specific object meant to the person who made it carries the necessary uncertainty of speaking across 3,000 years of silence. But what the figurine establishes beyond argument is this: the site was used, and the use had a particular character that left objects of apparent religious significance in the ground. Someone came here before the Greeks we read most about came here. Someone recognized something about the place and left behind this small clay form with its raised arms as evidence of that recognition. That figurine is still in the ground now, in the sense that the ground of Delphi carries all of its accumulated past within it. The Mycenaean beneath the archaic beneath the classical beneath the Hellenistic, centuries of sacred use laid down like sediment, each layer in its proper sequence, the whole thickness of the site's history compressed into the rock and soil of the terrace. The figurine recovered in excavation was found beneath several meters of accumulated earth, lying in the dark, undisturbed for the better part of 3,000 years. Its arms were still raised. The clay was worn smooth but intact. Whatever prayer or invocation its posture encoded was still preserved in the position of those arms, the gesture outlasting by an almost inconceivable margin, everything that the person who shaped it had lived through, cared about, lost, and left behind. There is a quality that certain ancient sites carry, something that is not merely the experience of old things accumulated in one place, but is closer to the experience of a threshold, a place where the ordinary categories that organize experience become less reliable, where the age of the site and the density of what has happened there creates a specific kind of presence. The ancient world understood this quality at Delphi to be divine in character, to be the expression of the god's presence and the oracle's function, and the sacred nature of the chasm and the pneuma and the spring. A modern visitor, walking through the excavated ruins, now open to the sky, experiences something different and something the same. The weight of the site's accumulated use, the specific feeling of standing on ground that has been recognized as significant for longer than most human institutions have existed. The interpretive frames change. The specific sensation of standing there does not entirely change. The Gulf of Corinth is visible from the sanctuary on clear days, far below and to the south. The distance between the Phaedriades and the Gulf is considerable. The terrain drops steeply through olive groves and the ancient coastal road, through the small modern town that occupies what was once the lower settlement associated with the sanctuary, down to the flat water far below. On a bright afternoon, the Gulf is silver from this height, the surface catching the sun and reflecting it in a way that makes it appear less like a body of water and more like a gap in the landscape, a flatness between the mountains on either side. The Phaedriades, lit from above, throw their reflected brightness downward and outward, and the gulf below receives the afternoon light from the west. And for a few hours on certain days, the whole visible landscape from the terrace of the sanctuary is a study in reflected illumination, the cliffs above catching and releasing the sun, the water below doing the same thing from a different angle, the terrace of the sanctuary suspended between them. The pilgrims arrived from two directions, mostly from the sea to the south, following the road up through the olive groves, the gulf receding behind them as they climbed, from the mountain passes to the north, where the road came through the high country and descended toward the sanctuary, with the cliffs ahead and below. Both roads converged on the same approach, the same requirement, the same first act, the spring. Before any engagement with the sanctuary, before any question was formulated, or any offering made, or any audience with the Pythia arranged, the Castalian spring, the cold water of it, the particular clarity of it, the sound of it in the gorge between the cliffs, audible before the gorge itself opened up, the water announcing its presence through the rock around it. To arrive at the spring, after a journey of any length, was a specific experience. The journey from Athens overland took several days. The road passing through Pythia, through the pass at the Phocian border, into the high plateau country, before the descent to Delphi. The journey by sea, and then overland from the Corinthian coast, was shorter, but no less exhausting for the climb at the end of it. Whatever the traveler had carried from home, whatever question, whatever burden, whatever desperation or hope or obligation had made the journey necessary, they carried it up to this point and then stopped. The spring, the cold water, the ritual of washing that made them fit for what came next. The sound of the water in the rock, steady and unhurried, the same sound it had been making since before the sanctuary was built around it. Parnassus rises behind the cliffs, and above them, the mountain's highest peaks are above 2,400 meters, substantially above the altitude of the sanctuary, which sits at roughly 570 meters on its terrace. The mountain is large in every direction that can be seen from the sanctuary, upward where the limestone peaks disappear into whatever weather the upper slopes are holding, to the east and west, where the massif extends across the skyline, and in the character of the air itself, which carries from the high ground above, even on warm days, a specific coolness that belongs to altitude. Parnassus was understood in the ancient world to be sacred in multiple ways, to Apollo, to the Muses, to Dionysus, whose winter presence on the mountain alternated in some traditions with Apollo's summer residence at the site below. The mountain was large enough and complex enough to hold several sacred associations simultaneously, its peaks and caves and rocky clefts providing the physical vocabulary for the different characters attributed to it. The caves of Parnassus are a particular feature of the landscape. The limestone that makes up the mountain is riddled with the kind of irregular cavities that limestone produces over geological time, and the face of the mountain above the sanctuary and in the surrounding terrain is broken by cave openings of various sizes. Cool air moves outward from them on warm afternoons, the same effect on a smaller scale as the cooling that happens in the shadow of the Phaedriades. The interior of the mountain maintaining a temperature lower than the sun-warmed exterior. The difference in air pressure drawing the cave breath outward through the opening. The cave mouth is the boundary between the warmth of the exposed slope and the cold of the interior dark. To stand at the edge of one of these openings is to feel the mountain's specific temperature against the face, a breath of cold air that belongs to the depths of the rock, to the places that have not seen sun since the mountain was formed. The tradition that Gaia held the oracle before any other deity held it is in part a way of describing this physical quality, the oracle's connection to what is below the surface, to the deep interior of the earth, to the breath rising from the chasm in the Aditon. An oracle that belongs to the earth goddess is an oracle that belongs to the ground itself, to the specific properties of this particular ground, at this particular place, on the slope of this particular mountain. The pneuma that Plutarch described rising from the fissure in the Aditon floor was understood in the ancient world as the exhalation of the god, the breath of divine presence made physically detectable by those who entered the innermost chamber, correctly prepared. But the fissure itself was in the rock. The breath came from below the rock. Whatever moved through that crack in the floor of the Adon moved through the same limestone that formed the Phaedriades, the same mountain that extended above and around the sanctuary in every direction, the same geological body that Gaia's name was, in one reading, a name for the Aditon, the innermost sanctuary, the room within the room, the space that was not entered by ordinary worshippers and not entered without preparation, even by those who served the oracle. In the physical remains of the site, the layout of the Temple of Apollo places this interior chamber at the west end of the building, the furthest point from the entrance, the most enclosed space within the already enclosed structure of the temple itself. The floor of the Adwain is where the fissure was located, where the pneuma rose, where the Pythia sat on her tripod during the periods when the oracle was active and received the divine breath and spoke what the god communicated through her. The specific architecture of that space, the depth within depth of it, room leading to room, threshold after threshold, was a physical expression of the sacred logic of the place. The oracle was not immediately available, not visible from the road or the forecourt, not accessible without preparation, not within easy reach even of those who had prepared correctly. What the Adaton contained, on an ordinary day when no consultation was taking place, was stillness and dim light and the faint sweetness in the air above the fissure. The smell that Plutarch recorded, the quality that had no obvious earthly source, that he connected to the divine presence of Apollo and to the sacred character of the site, would have been present in that interior space, whether the oracle was active or not, in the way that the Castalian spring was present and flowing, whether any pilgrim was washing in it or not. The character of the place did not depend on its being witnessed. The fissure breathed on its own terms. The sweetness in the air was there before anyone entered the room, and was there after they left. The omphalos, the navel stone, the rounded marker that in the Greek cosmological tradition indicated the center of the world, was kept in the sanctuary, and was understood to mark the point at which the two eagles released by Zeus from opposite ends of the earth had met in their flight. This story belongs properly to a later moment in the sanctuary's history, after Apollo had claimed the site and established his oracle there. But the cosmological logic of the claim that this particular point on the map of the Greek world was the center of everything, the place where the structure of the world was anchored, expressed something that the site's character had implied long before the story was attached to it. Delphi occupied the center of the ancient Greek world in the imagination of that world, not because it was geographically central, but because what happened there was understood to have implications that reached outward in all directions, north to the mountain passes, south to the Gulf, east and west across the Greek world, and beyond it, toward the edges of the known earth, and the divine order that organized it. The terracotta figurines and the Mycenaean pottery, and the traces of pre-classical settlement do not tell us exactly what the people who made them understood themselves to be doing at this site. The distance is too great, the record too fragmentary, the silence of those centuries too complete. What they tell us is that the recognition was old, that whatever quality made this particular terrace on the southwestern slope of Parnassus feel like a place where the surface of the ordinary world grew thin, the cliffs, the spring, the cave breath, the fissure, the sweetness in the air of the innermost room was recognized long before it was named, and was named long before the specific divine order that gave it its most enduring name arrived to claim it. The spring continues to flow through the gorge between the Phaedriades. Modern visitors to the Delphi archaeological site pass near its source on the path between the site entrance and the museum. The water is cold and clear over the pale stone at the bottom of the gorge. The sound of it fills the narrow space between the cliffs, as it has always filled that space, the steady, low rush of moving water in enclosed stone, audible before the spring itself is visible, present in the rock around it as much as in the air above it. Whatever the water meant to those who came here to wash in it, before entering the sanctuary, the purification, the threshold, the specific act of preparing the body to be in the presence of something that required preparation, the physical fact of the water persists, the sound of it persists, the coolness of it and the quality of the light in the gorge, and the specific sensation of moving from the open air of the path into the shadow of the cliffs. The oracle's period of active functioning extended, in ancient sources, across many centuries of Greek and later Roman engagement with it. Plutarch, writing in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries of the Common Era, was a priest at the sanctuary during what was already understood as a late period in its history, a period of reduced activity compared to what the classical authors described, a period in which the number of active consultation days had decreased, in which the questions coming to the oracle were smaller and more local than the grand civic and political questions of earlier centuries. But Plutarch wrote about the place with evident personal feeling for it, a feeling that had the character of long familiarity, of someone who had sat beside the Castalian spring in the morning before the sanctuary was open, who had entered the Adyton in the course of priestly duties, who had smelled the pneuma in that interior room and thought carefully about what it was. The slope of Parnassus above the sanctuary catches the last light of the afternoon after the Phaedriades themselves have moved into shadow. The upper faces of the cliffs lose the direct sun before the peaks above do, and there is a brief interval in the late afternoon when the rocky terrain above the sanctuary remains lit, while the terrace of the sanctuary itself is already in the cooler shadow of the cliff faces. The light on the mountain above is different from the light reflected from the Phaedriades, warmer, more diffuse, the kind of light that happens when the sun is low and lateral, and the illuminated surface is not polished limestone, but rough mountain terrain, scrub oak and maquis, and the pale gray-green of native herbs on the hillside. The light arrives at this point in the afternoon, already having traveled a long horizontal distance, already warmed and orange, making the upper mountain briefly vivid before it too passes into shadow. In that brief window of late light, the sanctuary below is already dim. The forecourt, the temple building, the interior chambers, all of it cooling as the Phaedriades take the shadow onto themselves and the afternoon warmth dissipates. The Adyton at the western end of the temple is the first part of the interior to cool and the last part to warm when morning comes. The fissure in its floor runs in a direction that the ancient sources describe in general terms, but that the physical evidence does not entirely corroborate. The archaeological record at Delphi being complicated by the multiple phases of building and rebuilding that the site underwent across its long history. What the ancient sources agree on is this: there was a crack in the rock of the Adyton floor. The crack was ancient, the breath that rose from it was sweet. The air above the fissure was, in Plutarch's account, slightly warmer than the air in the rest of the chamber. That warmth above the fissure is the last detail that matters here. The specific small physical fact of a slightly elevated temperature over a crack in very old stone in the innermost room of a building that had not yet been built when the crack first opened, in the ground of a site that had been recognized as sacred since before the tradition that eventually named it most famously had arrived to claim it. The warmth is faint. It would not be remarkable in most contexts. Against the cool air of the Adyton in the dimming afternoon, with the springs still audible through the walls of the cliffs outside, with the smell of the pneuma in the enclosed air of the chamber, it would be the thing a person noticed last and remembered longest, the small, steady warmth rising from the stone, the breath of the earth moving upward through the crack, the oldest thing in the sanctuary making itself known through the simplest physical fact available to it. Something very old is waiting beneath the stone. It has been waiting since before the stone above it was shaped and set in place, since before the sanctuary was recognized as a sanctuary, since before the mountain had a name in any language that survives. It is not restless. It is not urgent. The breath rises at its own pace, all the same pace. It has always risen, consistent and unhurried, and the faint warmth above the fissure persists into the cooling afternoon and will persist through the night and will be there in the morning when the light finds its way back through the entrance of the temple and makes its slow progress toward the innermost chamber. Whatever is below the stone is below it still, and the stone is still above it, and the air in the Adyton holds its particular quality, that specific sweetness, with no earthly source, quietly, in the dark, where it has always been. On the warm side of a limestone cliff, on an afternoon in late summer, the air flows differently at the mouth of a cave. The rock around the entrance has been sitting in full sun for hours. It is hot to the touch, pale and dry, radiating a stored heat that the body reads immediately as the heat of something solid and very old. But at the threshold itself, at the precise line where the outer air and the cave's interior air meet, there is a breath of cold moving outward. Not a wind, not a draught in any ordinary sense, simply the cave exhaling, slowly and without interruption, the cool dark air of its interior, pressing gently past anything standing at the entrance, cooling the face and forearms before the rest of the afternoon resumes. On the slopes of Mount Parnassus, in the region the Greeks knew as Phocis, there are many such caves. The mountain's limestone is ancient, and limestone is patient. It dissolves slowly under water, opening chambers and passages over thousands of years, producing the kind of terrain where a cliff face will offer a dozen dark openings within a short walk of one another, each exhaling its particular cold breath on a warm afternoon, each marking a boundary between the sun-warmed surface of the world and whatever the mountain holds inside itself. The caves are not dramatic. They do not announce themselves. They are simply there, in the rock, as they have been for longer than the mountain has had a name. It was in terrain like this, on the steep, fractured, cave-riddled slopes of Parnassus, that the oldest accounts of the tradition place the creature known as Python. Python was born from Gaia. That is the most widely attested claim in the ancient sources, and it is worth holding for a moment before moving past it, because it is not a minor detail. Gaia was not merely a goddess of the earth in the way that, say, a deity might preside over a particular river or a stand of trees. Gaia was the earth, the primordial substance, the ground of all generated things, the body that the world was made of. She was understood in the tradition to predate the Olympians entirely, to predate the Titans, to predate nearly everything except the first, formless conditions of existence. To be born from Gaia was to be born from the deepest available source of cosmic power. It was to be, in some sense, the Earth's own creature, not summoned or created by a god, but grown directly from the ground itself, an extension of the same generative force that raised the mountains and filled the sea basins and pushed the plants upward through the soil in spring. Python in the tradition was a serpent. The ancient sources are consistent on this, and the vase paintings that survive confirm it, a large coiling form rendered in precise lines, the scales suggested by careful overlapping curves, the body filling nearly the entire available surface of whatever clay it was painted on. The earliest images show a creature of considerable scale, the coils dense and patient, the head raised or resting, the body in an attitude of settled permanence rather than motion. What the images convey, above all else, is weight. This was not a creature in the habit of moving quickly. This was a creature in the habit of being present. Ovid, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era in his Metamorphoses, offered a specific account of Python's origins that differs from the simpler claim of divine parentage and deserves its own attention. In Ovid's telling, Python arose after the Great Flood, the flood associated with Deucalion, the Greek tradition's account of a catastrophic deluge that drowned the known world, and from which only a small remnant of humanity survived. When the waters receded, Ovid wrote, they left behind vast deposits of mud and slime, the accumulated sediment of the flooded earth, warm now in the returning sun, steaming gently, dense with the raw generative material that the earth contained. From this mud, new life arose spontaneously, without direction and without intention, the earth's excess producing creatures of kinds that had not existed before. Python was among them, vast, unprecedented, a kind of residual creature of the flood, born not from a divine parent in any personal sense, but from the sheer generative excess of a saturated earth. The two accounts, Python as Gaia's offspring, Python as a creature of the post-flood mud, are not necessarily in conflict. They both describe the same essential thing, a being whose origins lie entirely within the earth, generated by the earth's own processes, connected to no Olympian lineage, and indebted to no divine patron above. They are different framings of the same deep claim about what Python was and where it belonged in the order of things. Whether it came from the living body of the earth goddess or from the inanimate mud of the flooded plain, Python was the earth's creature, shaped by forces that ran far deeper than the relatively recent arrangement of the Olympian hierarchy. And because Python was the earth's creature, the earth gave it work to do. The sacred site at Delphi, the gorge, the chasm, the spring, the rock shelves of the mountain, was understood in the tradition to have been a place of oracle long before Apollo arrived. The earth itself was the original oracle. The pneuma rising from the crack in the stone was Gaia's breath, and the prophetic power associated with the site was Gaia's power, and the creature that guarded the site served Gaia's purposes. Python at Delphi was not an invader or an occupier. It was performing a function assigned to it by the source from which it had come. Guardian and guarded shared the same origin, the same chthonic root, the same connection to whatever lay beneath the thin skin of the mountain's rock surface. The nature of that guardianship was, in the tradition, simply presence. Python at the sacred chasm was Python being what it was, an enormously large, enormously old creature of the deep earth, resting across or near the threshold of the oracle, its sheer scale and stillness constituting a kind of protection that required no active effort.
Okay.
Nothing approaches a creature of that size without calculation. Nothing crosses a boundary marked by a coiled body of that dimension without acknowledgement. The guardianship was architectural. Python did not need to act. Python only needed to be there, in the way that a mountain only needs to be there, and the approach to whatever lay beyond it becomes a different kind of thing. In the tradition, Python's connection to the oracle was understood in terms of breath. The pneuma, that sweet-smelling exhalation from the chasm in the rock, was the same breath that animated the prophetic function of the site, and Python lay at the source of it. The creature breathed the same air the oracle breathed, or, understood another way, Python breathed out, and the oracle received what was given. The serpent's body, and the sacred chasm, and the prophetic voice that emerged from the site were, in this reading, part of a single system, the earth speaking through its own creature, the creature marking the place where the speaking occurred. This is a very particular understanding of what a sacred guardian is, and it is different from the later understanding that the myth's resolution would establish. Under Gaia's order, the oracle at Delphi was not administered by priests who had to travel, purify themselves, and manage access according to a calendar of feast days. The sacred presence was simply there, in the rock, in the breath of the chasm, in the body of the creature that lay across its threshold. The site was sacred because of what it was, not because of what had been built upon it or assigned to it by a god who had arrived from elsewhere. Python's guardianship was an expression of this order, old, imminent, requiring nothing external to legitimate it. Several surviving vase paintings give enough detail to reconstruct something of how ancient Greeks visualized this creature. On one fragment, the serpent is shown coiling against a rocky surface, its body rendered in careful black lines against the pale clay, the scales dense along the upper surface of the spine and finer along the sides. The head is proportionally large, the jaw suggested in its width, the eye marked with a careful dot. The overall impression is of precise, unhurried craft. A painter, attentive to the specific visual qualities of a very large serpent interested in getting the scale right, in conveying through the arrangement of coils a body that does not fit easily in any single frame. This was not a symbolic serpent drawn in shorthand. This was an attempt, within the conventions of the style, to show what something of that size actually looked like. Ovid pushed the scale further. In his account, Python was a creature of size so unprecedented that no name yet existed for what it was. He described a body of immense extent, a weight and mass for which the landscape itself seemed barely sufficient. This was the language of excess appropriate to a creature that had come from the flood's excess, a being whose dimensions exceeded the ordinary categories of size, and entered a register where the human mind could only take measurements by comparing the creature to landmarks rather than to other living things. Ovid's Python was large enough to be a feature of the terrain rather than a creature within it, the coils occupying a hillside the way an outcrop of rock might occupy a hillside, the presence of the serpent changing the scale of everything nearby. What Ovid's account communicates, beneath the description of size, is the same thing that the vase paintings communicate in their more restrained way. Python was a creature of a different order than the creatures that had come before or would come after it. Its scale placed it outside the ordinary relationships of predator and prey, outside the familiar grid of creatures that could be hunted, avoided, managed, or understood through normal categories. It was instead a creature that defined its environment, that made the space around it into something other than open terrain, that turned the ordinary mountain into something with a different kind of presence. On the slopes of Parnassus, in the caves and rocky clefts above the gorge where the Castalian spring ran cold through the limestone, Python's presence was of this kind. The tradition does not describe Python roaming widely, or hunting regularly, or ranging across the broader landscape of focus in the manner of a predatory animal. What the tradition describes, when it describes Python at all, is Python at the oracle, present at the threshold, occupying the space around the chasm, the body settled into the contours of the rock, the head level with the fissure that produced the sacred breath, permanence over motion. The guardianship conducted through stillness rather than through action. In the centuries before Apollo came to Parnassus, the tradition holds that the sacred site operated under this arrangement: Gaia as the original divine patron of the oracle, Python as the guardian and embodiment of the earth's presence at the site, the prophetic breath rising from the crack in the rock, all of it continuous, all of it rooted in the same chthonic logic that ran through the deep structure of the old cosmological order, the order in which the earth was the first and most fundamental divinity, predating the sky gods, predating the Olympian arrangement, preceding everything that came later by an interval so vast that it barely registered in human time. The tradition also assigns Python a specific act that extends its role beyond the oracle at Delphi and gives the creature a place in the larger narrative of divine succession. In one of the most widely repeated episodes, Hera, Zeus's consort, and a figure associated throughout the tradition with the vigorous protection of her position, instructed Python to pursue Leto, who was pregnant with Apollo and Artemis. The instruction was to prevent Leto from finding a place to give birth, to drive her from one possible refuge to the next, to ensure that no part of the known world would offer the shelter she needed. Python, in this episode, moves, it crosses the landscape. It is no longer the still guardian of the oracle, but a creature in motion, covering ground, closing off options, the enormous body moving through the terrain with a purpose directed by divine authority. What the tradition describes in this episode is worth sitting with carefully, because it is not the action of a creature motivated by malice in any straightforward sense. Python was following instruction. The instruction came from within the existing divine order. Hera's authority was legitimate within the structure of that order, and Python's compliance was, within the same structure, an act of service. The creature crossing the landscape in pursuit of Leto was not operating outside its assigned function. It was extending that function into a new context, moving from the specific guardianship of the Delphic site to a broader service in the interest of the order it belonged to. Leto's situation, in the tradition's account of this pursuit, was one of extraordinary difficulty. Every land she approached had been warned away by Hera's instruction, or was itself unwilling to risk the divine queen's displeasure by offering shelter to her rival's pregnant servant. Leto moved across a rocky landscape that offered nothing, no shelter sufficient for the birth, no tree large enough to stand under, no cave sufficiently hidden, the horizon empty of relief in every direction. The pursuit was not always close in the physical sense. It did not need to be. The effect of Python's existence, crossing the terrain behind her, was sufficient to close off the world ahead. What makes this episode significant for understanding Python is the nature of what it establishes between the serpent and the god who would later kill it. The confrontation at Delphi would not be between strangers with no history. It would be between a creature and a figure whose very existence had been shaped, in part, by what the creature did during Leto's wandering. Apollo was born because Delos finally agreed to receive Leto, because no pursuit could follow her to a floating island that had not yet been fixed to the earth. But the wandering itself, the difficulty, the refusal, the exhausted searching across a world that had been closed against her, that was Python's work. The god born on Delos carried that history into the world, whether the myth makes explicit what it meant or not. The tradition does not suggest that Python understood this. The creature's nature, as the sources describe it, was not one given to anticipation or reflection of that kind. Python was a creature of the deep earth, operating in the present of its existence, performing the functions assigned to it by its origins and by the divine authorities that directed it. The great body coiling across the landscape or resting at the oracle was not scheming. It was simply being what it was, doing what it had been made to do, in the way that the earth itself is simply what it is, generating and containing and sustaining without intention or awareness of consequence. The caves of Parnassus on a summer afternoon, cool air moving outward from each dark entrance as the warm afternoon presses gently against the cliff. The stone of the mountain in its usual indifference to any particular hour, to any particular creature resting within it, to the long patient interval of years piling up against its surface, somewhere within the rock, or pressed against its face, or lying across the threshold of the sacred chasm where the sweet-smelling breath came up from below. The enormous body of Python settled into whatever the day required of it, which was, mostly, nothing. The mountain continued. The breath rose from the crack in the stone. The coils of the guardian accommodated the contours of the rock, the way water accommodates the contours of a basin, finding the lowest and most stable position and resting there. The size that Ovid described, and that the vase painters attempted in their own way to convey, was not merely a quality of the creature in isolation. It was a quality of the relationship between the creature and everything around it. A very large body in a landscape changes the scale of the landscape. The rocks nearby become smaller. The distance from one ridge to another becomes something that can be measured in coils rather than in paces. The shadow cast by the creature in the afternoon sun stretches across features of the terrain that would otherwise be defined only by the sun itself. Python, at Delphi, was not a creature that fit into the landscape. It was a creature that the landscape organized itself around, the cliffs and gorges and cave mouths arranging themselves in the imagination of the tradition as the setting appropriate to a creature of that scale and that origin. The word that the tradition uses again and again when describing Python's role at the oracle is a word that translates roughly as guardian, but the Greek concept behind it is worth its own moment of attention, because the English word carries implications of active watchfulness, of a figure scanning the horizon, alert to approach, ready to respond. The Greek understanding, as it comes through in the sources, is somewhat different. A guardian in this sense is not primarily an active agent, but a presiding presence. The guardianship is constituted by being at the place, by the quality of the creature's relationship to the site, by its origin from the same source that made the site sacred, by the way its presence acknowledged and confirmed the significance of what it guarded. Python guarded the oracle the way the earth guards its own depths, not by watching and responding, but by being the thing itself, continuous with what it protected. This is a useful distinction for understanding what the tradition says Python was, and what the tradition says was at stake in Apollo's eventual arrival. The old order at Delphi was not merely defended by Python, it was embodied in Python. The guardian and the oracle were of the same substance, extensions of the same chthonic root. What Apollo would arrive to claim was not simply a location, but a whole system of understanding about what the oracle was and where its authority came from. Python's presence at the site was not incidental to that system, it was structural. The creature lying across the threshold of the sacred chasm was in some important sense the visual and physical form of the claim that the old order made about the nature of prophecy and the nature of the sacred. None of this in the tradition's account made Python invulnerable. The old order had its vulnerabilities, as all orders do. Oh, so not moral vulnerabilities, not failures of legitimacy, but the specific structural condition of all existing arrangements, which is that new arrangements are possible. The earth produces what the earth produces. It produced Python, born from Gaia's depths or from the flood's excess, bearing a legitimate function and performing it with the permanence and patience of the earth itself. The earth also, in time, bore other things, other forces, other claims, other beings, whose nature was not chthonic but celestial, whose light came not from below but from above, whose authority derived not from depth and continuity, but from brightness and declaration. But that time had not yet come, in the portion of the myth that concerns Python in its own terms. In this part of the story, the creature is at rest. The caves of Parnassus exhale their cool air into the warm afternoon. The sacred chasm breathes its sweet exhalation upward through the crack in the rock. The coils of the guardian settle against the stone, the body finding its accommodation in the landscape as a river finds its accommodation in a valley, not shaped by the terrain, but shaping it, gradually, over a long and unhurried interval. The head rests level with the fissure in the floor of the oracle's innermost space, the breath of the earth moving past the creature's own slow breath, in the half-dark, the two breaths indistinguishable to anyone standing at the threshold, looking in. The tradition holds that Python had been performing this guardianship for a very long time. How long is not specified in any ancient source with any precision. Long enough that the arrangement had the quality of permanence, the quality of things that have been in a particular way for so long that it becomes difficult to imagine them having been otherwise. Long enough that the cave mouths and the gorge and the Castalian spring and the chasm in the floor of the oracle's chamber and the creature across its threshold were all, in the imagination of those who approach the site, a single continuous thing, all expressions of the same ancient, immanent, deeply rooted presence that the Greeks understood when they spoke of Gaia's dominion. The word for this kind of long, continuous, uninterrupted presence is not easily found in English. Greek had something closer to it, a sense of existing in deep time, of being constituted by deep time, of being old in a way that does not register as age in the ordinary sense, but rather as a quality of substance. The granite on a mountainside is not old in the way that an elderly person is old. It is old in the way that something that has always been there and will always be there is old. Old as a condition of its nature, not as a fact about its biography. Python in the tradition had this quality. The creature was not ancient in the way a long-lived animal is ancient. It was ancient in the way the earth is ancient, constituted by time, made of it, the long interval of its existence, not something that had happened to it, but something it was made of. The caves of Parnassus, on a late summer afternoon, when the light comes slant across the white limestone, and the shadows pool in the clefts, and the cold breath continues to press outward from each dark entrance as steadily and indifferently as it has always done. The stone warm and dry where the sun has been on it for hours. The air around the threshold of each cave, neither warm nor cold, but both, the two conditions meeting there and blending briefly before the afternoon, reasserts itself. Somewhere on the mountain, at the specific location the tradition marks, near the gorge, near the spring, near the place where the rock is cracked open and the deep breath of the earth comes up through the fissure, the guardian continues, not watching, not waiting, simply being present in the old way, the deep earth way, the way that requires no effort and no intention, because it is simply what the creature is, in the place the creature belongs, performing through its existence alone the function assigned to it by the source from which it came. The sacred chasm below the surface of the rock, the sweet breath rising, the body of the guardian settled across the threshold. The afternoon on the mountain, warm and still, the white limestone holding its heat as it always does, the shadows lengthening in the gorge below as the sun moves, the cold air from the caves continuing its patient outward press against the warmth of the day, the mountain doing what mountains do, which is everything and nothing, slow and vast and entirely indifferent to the hour or the season or the particular century in which any given afternoon finds itself. Python at rest across the threshold of the oracle's chasm, the coils accommodating the rock, the head level with the fissure, the guardian and the guarded sharing the same breath, the same depth, the same implacable continuity, not waiting for anything, not preparing for anything, simply present in the old way, at the old place, in the long unhurried service of the earth that made it. Before Apollo was anything, before he carried a bow, before he spoke from a chasm in the earth, before his name was spoken at all, there was an island that barely existed. Delos sits in the middle of the Aegean Sea among the Cyclades, a loose scatter of islands arranged by the ancient imagination as a ring around it, as though the other islands had drawn back to leave a space. The island itself is small, it is low. In the ancient descriptions that survive, it is almost featureless, a pale strip of rock and thin soil rising just enough above the waterline to catch the wind, with no great mountain, no dense forest, no particular reason for anyone to consider it significant. In the accounts that hold it as sacred, it is described as having once been unmoored, drifting on the surface of the Aegean without being fixed to anything beneath, neither anchored nor permanent. What the tradition tells is that the island was, before a certain event, simply there, present but inconsequential, adrift in the flat Aegean light, the kind of place a ship passes without slowing. The goddess Leto had been searching. The tradition describes her crossing the Greek world, looking for a place willing to receive her, a place that would not turn her away. She was carrying two children, not yet born. She was the daughter of the Titans Coeus and Phoebe, one of the older generation of divine figures, patient and persistent in the way that older things sometimes are, enduring where the younger gods might have faltered. The world, in the version the tradition holds, had become hostile to her passage. One place after another refused to offer ground firm enough or willing enough to receive what she was carrying. The sacred sites of the mainland had their reasons, the larger islands had their reasons. What the myth preserves in most of its versions is the image of Leto still moving, crossing water, crossing rock, the horizon offering no certain shelter. Delos was willing. The story accounts for its willingness in different ways across different tellings, but the central fact of it remains consistent. The small, drifting, almost nothing island was the one place in the Aegean that said yes. Some versions of the tradition describe a promise made to Delos that what was born there would become so magnificent that the island would never lack for worship or for offerings, that its insignificance would be transformed by what had happened on its ground. Whatever the agreement, Delos accepted Leto, and the tradition holds that once it did, the island stopped drifting. It settled. It became fixed to the floor of the sea, and it has been fixed there ever since, in the way that places where sacred things occur tend, in mythology, to become stable, to stop moving and become themselves. The birth, as the Homeric hymn to Apollo describes it, was not quiet. The hymn is among the oldest surviving accounts of Apollo's origins, composed probably sometime in the 7th century before the Common Era, recited by performers called rhapsodes at religious festivals where the audience already knew the story and came to hear it, given shape again in the old hexameter verse. The Delian section of the hymn, the part concerned with the birth itself, describes the moment of Apollo's arrival in the world as a transformation of the island's physical reality. The rock, according to the hymn, ran with gold, the air filled with the smell of ambrosia, the food of the gods, a fragrance that had no earthly source, and that no one standing on the island could have explained by any ordinary means. The palm trees bent. The ground shook gently, not with violence, but with the particular movement of something settling into a new configuration, a place discovering what it had become. The golden light described in the hymn is worth holding for a moment, because it does something specific in the logic of the myth. Delos had been barren. It had been too small, too spare, too rootless to be of consequence. And the light that arrived with Apollo was not simply atmospheric. It was the first sign of what the island had agreed to host. The tradition understands this radiance not as a decoration, but as a disclosure, the outward form of something that had previously been contained and was now in the world. What the island had given shelter to was making itself visible in the way that sacred presences, in these accounts, tend to become visible at the moment of their full arrival. The gold was the island announcing what had happened on its ground. Apollo is described in the ancient sources as the son of Zeus and Leto, which positions him, in the genealogy the tradition holds, at a particular kind of intersection. Zeus was the king of the Olympians, the current order of divine powers, the generation of gods that had displaced the Titans before them and had been ruling since. Leto was of the generation that preceded them, a Titaness, one of the older figures, patient in the particular way of things that have endured longer than what surrounds them. What this means for Apollo, in the logic of divine genealogy, is that two lines of inheritance meet in him: the Olympian order, with all its brightness and authority, and the older Titan generation, with its longer roots and its different relationship to the earth. A god with that parentage carries something of both, which is perhaps why, in the tradition's later accounts, Apollo is given so much more to hold than any single divine domain might ordinarily suggest. The domains attributed to Apollo in the ancient tradition are unusually numerous, and they do not obviously belong together. He was associated with light, with the sun's radiance, though he is not, in the oldest Greek tradition, the sun itself, that role belonging to Helios. He was associated with prophecy and with the particular kind of knowing that comes from a divine source, the voice from beneath the earth, the pattern in the flight of birds, the shape of what is coming before it arrives. He was associated with music and with poetry, with the lyre and with the order of verse, with the way that sound arranged deliberately can carry meaning farther than ordinary speech. He was associated with healing and with the sending of plague through his silver arrows, the same precise instrument capable of both, which is one of the tradition's more unsettling symmetries. A god who could end illness and also bring it, depending on what was asked of him or what he chose. These domains sit together strangely on the surface of it: light and plague, music and prophecy, healing and the capacity for sudden, precise, irrevocable damage. The tradition does not explain the combination in the sense of offering a logical argument for why a single god should preside over all of these things. What it does instead is present them together, century after century, and allow the combination to accumulate its own coherence. What emerged over the long span of how Apollo was understood in the Greek world is something like the idea of a force that operates through precision, through the arrow that goes exactly where it is aimed, the note that resolves exactly where the phrase requires it, the prophecy that discloses exactly what was previously hidden. The precision is the through line. Whether it serves or harms depends, in these accounts, on context. The most enduring of Apollo's epithets is Phoebus. The word Phoebus in ancient Greek carries the meaning of brightness, of shining, of a particular kind of clarity or purity. It is not simply the light of the sun described factually. It is light understood as a quality, the way that something radiant is also, in a different sense, unambiguous. What shines can be seen. What is bright does not conceal. To call Apollo Phoebus was to call him by the quality of his light, rather than by the category of his power, which tells something about how the ancient Greeks understood him, not primarily as a god who did things, though he did many things, but as a god whose essential nature was a kind of luminosity that preceded any particular action. The name functioned as a description every time it was spoken aloud. In festivals, in prayers, in the recitations of the Homeric hymn, to say the name Phoebus was already to say something about what he was before saying anything about what he had done. The Homeric hymn to Apollo is divided into two parts, and the division itself is telling. The first part concerns Delos, the birth, the island, the golden light, the moment of arrival. The second part concerns what the tradition calls the Pythian section, the account of Apollo's journey toward what would become his great sanctuary. The two sections are sometimes considered to have originated separately, composed at different times and brought together into a single hymn at some later point, a question that scholars have examined from a number of directions without arriving at a definitive answer. What matters for the purposes of the tradition is that they were understood together, the story of the god's birth and the story of the god's great claiming, held in a single extended poem, recited as a unit at the festivals dedicated to him. There is something worth noticing about the sequence the hymn establishes, even before its content is examined closely. Apollo is born on a floating island that has just become fixed. He arrives in a burst of golden light that transforms the physical landscape of the place where it occurs. And then, in the tradition's telling, he moves, not randomly, but towards something, along a path that the myth understands as inevitable. The trajectory is built into the structure of the poem. What the birth section of the hymn describes is a god arriving in the world with somewhere all ready to go, even if neither the island nor the listener knows it yet. At the moment the golden light fades and the smell of ambrosia begins to dissipate in the Aegean air. On Delos, in the aftermath of the birth, the palm trees stood again. The golden light described by the hymn did not sustain itself indefinitely. It was a birth light, the outward expression of an arrival, and once the arrival had occurred, the ordinary quality of afternoon returned to the island. The flat Aegean light coming off the water in the particular way it does at that latitude, clear and even and slightly pale. What remained was the island, now fixed in place, and the god who had been born on it, and the changed reality of what Delos had become by having offered its ground for that particular event. The tradition holds that the island became one of the most important sacred sites in the Greek world, precisely because of what had happened there, a place of pilgrimage and festival and offering, the low, barren strip of rock transformed entirely by the significance of what it had once allowed. Apollo himself, in the tradition's accounts, does not stay. The birth on Delos is the beginning, not the destination. What the myth describes in its Pythian section, the later part of the hymn, is a god in motion, traveling through the Greek world toward the place that will define his greatest role. Before that movement begins, though, it is worth remaining on Delos a little longer in the aftermath of the birth, with the golden light already fading and the ordinary Aegean afternoon reasserting itself around the island. There is a particular quality to these before moments in mythology, the instance just after a divine arrival, before the implications have fully unfolded. The island is still. The water moves around it in the way it always has. Whatever has just occurred has occurred, and the island is settling into being the kind of place it will now be for the remainder of its existence, the place where Apollo was born, fixed to the seafloor, no longer drifting. The silver bow that Apollo carries in the ancient depictions is worth considering as an object in itself, apart from what it does. It appears in vase painting, in sculpture, in the descriptions that survive in the texts, a bow of silver, typically shown across one shoulder or held in one hand, the strings slack in moments of rest. Its metal is specific, not gold, which belongs to other contexts in the tradition, but silver, the color of reflected light, of the moon on still water, of something that shines without generating its own heat. An unstrung bow is a bow at rest, its potential entirely contained within its resting form, the force it is capable of producing entirely invisible when it is not being used. The tradition tends to show Apollo carrying this bow in its quiet state, present, specific, capable, not yet drawn. There is a kind of patience in that image that suits what the tradition otherwise describes about this god, the precision that can wait, the force that is held until the moment requires its release. Apollo's association with the lyre comes through the myth in a different way, arrived at through a different story. The lyre, in the tradition, was made by Hermes, the messenger of the gods, who fashioned it from a tortoise shell and sheep gut, and then, in the characteristic manner of Hermes, used it to play his way out of trouble when he was caught having stolen Apollo's cattle as a newborn. What Hermes played in that account was so beautiful that Apollo, the god of music, presented here as hearing the lyre for the first time, accepted the instrument in exchange for the cattle, and the exchange became one of the founding stories of how music came to be among the gods. Apollo the archer and Apollo the musician are both present in the tradition, and what they share is not immediately obvious until the precision is noticed again, the arrow and the note both going exactly where they are intended to go, both requiring a kind of stillness in the moment before release. The island of Delos, in the centuries that followed the tradition's account of what happened there, became a center of religious activity of considerable scale. Archaeological excavations have uncovered evidence of sustained worship on the island across a long span of time, sanctuaries, temples, the material remains of offerings and festivals. The sanctuary of Apollo on Delos was understood throughout the classical Greek world as one of the god's two great sacred sites, the other being the sanctuary at Delphi, which the tradition describes as claimed through a different kind of event entirely. The two places were understood in relation to each other, Delos as the site of birth, Delphi as the site of claiming, the god's origins, and the god's great office, both given physical locations in the landscape of the Greek world, both places where a pilgrim could stand and know they were standing on ground the tradition had made significant. The question of why Apollo in particular, among all the gods of the Olympian tradition, came to be associated with prophecy as one of his central attributes is one that the tradition does not answer directly. The connection is simply given, built into the structure of who Apollo is as the myth presents him. What the tradition does describe is the manner of that prophetic knowing, not a private, individual perception, but something that passes through an appointed human intermediary, through the specific institution of the oracle. The god speaks. The oracle speaks for the god. The human world receives what arrives through that channel and attempts to understand it. The process is, in its structure, a translation from divine knowing to human language, across the threshold of a sacred space, through a person who has been prepared to stand at that particular intersection. There is something in the structure of Apolline prophecy, as the tradition describes it, that connects back to the qualities encoded in his name. Phoebus, bright, shining, clear, from the god whose nature is luminosity, is also the god through whom hidden things are disclosed, through whom what was dark becomes, if not fully visible, at least partially illuminated. The oracle at Delphi, in the tradition's account, does not simply tell the future in straightforward terms. It speaks in ways that require interpretation, in language that is ambiguous enough to require careful reading. But the disclosure itself, the act of making available something that was previously unavailable, belongs to the same quality that the epithet carries. To be bright is to reveal. To reveal is to make visible what was dark. The connection runs through the name itself. The Homeric hymn in its Pythian section describes Apollo moving through the Greek world with a particular kind of purposefulness, visiting places, giving them something, sometimes naming them, always moving in a direction that the narrative understands as the direction of Delphi. The journey has stops. There are places Apollo passes through on his way to what will become his great sanctuary, places that receive some trace of his presence and are marked by it, in the way that myths of divine travel tend to mark the landscape with the residue of the god's movement through it. The hymn lists these places by name, the geography of central Greece rendered as a kind of itinerary, a record of the god's passage through a landscape that the audience of the hymn would, in many cases, have known firsthand. What makes this journey section of the hymn interesting is the way it distributes the significance of Apollo's arrival. The god is not simply going from Delos to Delphi in a straight line. He is moving through the Greek world, and the world is receiving him as he moves, and the path he takes becomes, in the tradition's telling, a kind of consecration of the landscape itself. This is how mythology tends to work with the movement of gods. The passage of a divine figure through a physical place leaves that place changed, marked by the divine contact, given a story that subsequent visitors can know and stand inside. The hymn's journey section is, among other things, an account of how much of the Greek landscape came to carry Apollo's traces. The specific quality of Apollo's movement in these accounts, deliberate, purposeful, arriving where the tradition requires him to arrive, is worth setting against the image of his birth. He was born on a floating island that had no fixed location until the moment of his arrival. He moved into a landscape already full of sacred sites, already holding in its various places the traces of older divine presences. He carried a silver bow that could send force across great distances with precision. He was the son of the king of the gods and of a Titaness, which gave him inheritance from both the current order and the generation that preceded it. All of these things the tradition presents as simply true, simply given, the facts of who Apollo is assembled without apology or explanation, offered to the listener as the ground on which the story stands. There is a persistent quality in the ancient descriptions of Apollo that is worth naming directly because it runs through the imagery in a consistent way. The god is described as beautiful, repeatedly, and across many different sources, a beauty that is associated with brightness, with the particular quality of light that does not diffuse but arrives sharply, with the clarity of something that can be seen from a distance without distortion. This is not an incidental attribute in the tradition. The beauty of a god in Greek mythology tends to encode something about the god's nature, what they embody, what they make visible when they appear. Apollo's beauty in this tradition is the beauty of precision, of clarity, of something that does not blur at its edges or speak in more than one voice at once. Even the ambiguity of his oracles in this reading is not a failure of clarity, but a disclosure of the complexity inherent in what is being disclosed. The future, which is real and determined and available to a divine perception, is nevertheless not simple, and the prophetic language reflects that. The lyre as an instrument, the physical object that the tradition associates with Apollo above all other gods, produces sound by vibration, by the precisely controlled release of tension stored in the string. The string is held taut. The player's hand releases it at a specific point along its length. The vibration travels through the bridge into the body of the instrument and emerges as a note, a particular frequency, sustained for a determined duration, placed in a sequence that the tradition calls music. There is a structural similarity between this process and the use of the bow that is obvious once it is noticed. The string under tension, the controlled release, the force traveling in a precise direction, the result arriving exactly where it was aimed. That both the lyre and the silver bow belong to Apollo in the tradition is not, perhaps, a coincidence. They are different expressions of the same essential quality, the management of tension toward a particular, intended outcome, with the precision that the epithet Phoebus encodes in the god's very name. The ancient world understood music and prophecy as related things in ways that the modern world tends not to. The rhapsode who recited the Homeric hymn was not simply performing, was not simply delivering content for an audience's entertainment. The performance was understood as a kind of channeling, a bringing forward of something that had been given, the poet or performer as a conduit for something that passed through them rather than originating in them. The Muses in the Greek tradition were the sources of poetic inspiration, 9 divine figures who presided over the various forms of song and verse, and history and comedy and tragedy. Apollo was their leader, a role that gave him presiding authority over all of them. To sing under Apollo's guidance was, in this tradition, to speak not only from personal knowledge, but from a source that exceeded the individual speaker. That presiding role over the Muses connects Apollo's musical domain to his prophetic one more directly than might initially appear. Both the poet and the prophet, in the ancient Greek understanding, were receiving something, were open to a disclosure that came through them rather than from them, shaped by a divine source, and arriving in human language at the far end of the process. The difference between the Pythia speaking from beneath the temple and the rhapsode speaking the hexameter lines of the hymn is, in this tradition's terms, a difference of degree and occasion rather than of fundamental kind. Apollo presided over both. His brightness was the condition of the disclosure in each case, the quality that made visible, that illuminated, that brought to human language what would otherwise have remained in the dark. The island of Delos, in the particular light of a Greek afternoon, has a quality that ancient writers described with some consistency. The light at that latitude comes off the water in a specific way, flat, even, slightly silvered rather than golden, the kind of light that renders things clearly without the diffusing warmth of later afternoon. The island itself, low and pale, sits inside that light in a way that makes it look almost suspended, neither strongly present nor absent, occupying its space in the Aegean without emphatic weight. It is easy to understand why the tradition might have described it, before the birth, as an island that was not fully fixed, that drifted, that had no firm relationship with the seafloor beneath it. The visual quality of the place in ordinary light supports that description, as though the island is still slightly uncertain of its own permanence. After the golden light described by the Homeric hymn faded, and the ordinary afternoon light of the Aegean returned to Delos, the island was changed in a way that ordinary light could not display. What had changed was not visible in the pale, even quality of the afternoon. It was carried in the tradition, in the stories told afterward, in the pilgrims who came, and the festivals that were held, and the offerings that accumulated at the sanctuary over centuries. The significance of what had occurred on Delos was held not in the island's appearance, but in the community of memory surrounding it, in the shared understanding that this low, pale, once drifting place was the ground on which something specific and unrepeatable had happened, which is, in a sense, how all sacred sites work in the ancient world. The sacredness is not a property of the stone, but of what the tradition has agreed the stone carries. There is a quality in the image of the newly born Apollo that the hymn generates, and that the tradition around him sustains, that is worth dwelling in before moving further into his story. He is described as golden, as bringing gold into the world with him at the moment of his birth. And yet the traditional epithet, phoebos, does not emphasize gold, but a different quality of brightness, something cleaner, less warm, closer to the quality of moonlight, or to the sharp clarity of high-altitude sunlight, where the air is thin enough to let through what lower altitudes diffuse. The birth gold is the overwhelming, immediate disclosure of a divine arrival. The phoebos that persists as his name is the sustained quality, the brightness that is not a single event, but an ongoing condition of the god's being in the world. Both qualities are present in Apollo as the tradition constructs him, and they are not in conflict. The overwhelming golden brightness of the birth on Delos and the clear, sustained luminosity of the epithet are different registers of the same nature, the arrival and the continuity, the moment of disclosure, and the ongoing fact of a light that does not dim. What the tradition presents is a God whose most essential quality is visibility in himself and in what he makes possible for others to see. The oracles, the music, the poetry, the healing, the precise arrow that finds its mark across an impossible distance, all of these, in the logic of the tradition, are expressions of the same quality. The God who was born in a burst of gold on a newly fixed island brings wherever he goes the condition of things becoming available to be seen. The palm tree on Delos, described in the Homeric hymn as the tree Leto held as she gave birth, is a detail worth noticing for what it quietly establishes. A palm tree on a low rocky island in the Aegean, present before the birth, persisting after it, standing on ground that has just become permanently significant. In the ancient world, the palm was associated with Apollo at Delos specifically, and pilgrims to the island knew the tree as a particular object connected to the myth of the god's arrival. The tree was a living marker of the event, not made to commemorate it, not placed there afterward, but simply having been there when it happened, and then remaining. There is something in that image, the tree that was present at the beginning and continues to exist in the ordinary time after the extraordinary event, that the tradition returns to periodically in various forms. The sacred site marked not by what was built, but by what was already there and then remained. The Aegean light above Delos, after the golden birthlight had faded, would have been exactly what it had always been, flat, clear, slightly silver, moving with the water beneath it. The island had not changed in any visible way. It was still low. It was still pale. The thin soil was still thin. The rock beneath the soil was still the same limestone it had always been. What had changed was invisible to the eye, but absolute in the tradition's terms. The island was now fixed. The god had been born, and the ordinary afternoon light that came off the water and fell across the stone was now the light that came off the water and fell across the ground, where Apollo had first been in the world. The light did not know this. The stone did not know this. The tradition knew it, and carried it forward in the hexameter lines of the hymn, in the recitations at festivals, in the pilgrimages, in the accounts that accumulated across centuries, until the small, low, once drifting island was one of the most significant sacred sites in the Greek world, all of it resting on a single event in a burst of gold that no one alive had witnessed, but everyone in the tradition shared. The newly born Apollo, the god in the first moments of his presence in the world, before the silver bow, before the journey toward Delphi, before the great claiming of the oracle, lay on an island that was settling into its new permanence around him. The gold was fading. The smell of ambrosia was thinning in the Aegean air. The palm tree stood. The water moved around the island in the particular unhurried way of deep water, slow and even and indifferent to what had just occurred on the shore. The island had agreed to receive the god and had been fixed in place by that agreement, and now held the fact of what had happened on its ground in the only way a place can hold such things, by being where it was, available to be visited, the stone still warm from the afternoon, the light already beginning its slow change toward evening. On the slope of Parnassus, the silver bow is already drawn. The god stands with the string pulled back to his jaw, the metal of the bow bent under a tension that belongs entirely to the moment before release, that particular stillness in which everything that is about to happen is already, in some sense, decided. The distance between Apollo and the Python is not large. It does not need to be. What matters is the angle, the line drawn through the air between the nocked arrow and the creature that has held this ground for longer than the mountain has held its name. The slope is pale with limestone. The afternoon light comes across it at a low angle, throwing the shadows of every loose stone into long dark ribbons across the rock. Nothing moves. The air holds still, the way air sometimes does before a thing that cannot be undone. The Homeric hymn to Apollo describes what followed as a rapid and overwhelming volley, silver arrows loosed in such succession that the creature was filled with festering wounds before its coils had fully registered what was striking them. The god, in the tradition's account, did not hesitate. He did not circle the python or attempt to find a more advantageous position. He stood on the open slope, and he loosed his arrows, and the arrows found their mark, and the marks multiplied, until the serpent's vast body could no longer hold up under the accumulation of them. There is something in the hymn's account that is less like a battle than like a declaration, a statement made in the language of arrows, repeated until it could not be argued with. The earth would feed the serpent no more. That is what the god says, in the tradition's own words, standing over the creature he has brought down. The earth would feed it no more. Ovid, writing in the Metamorphoses several centuries after the composition of the Homeric hymn, gives the battle a different scale. In Ovid's account, the python is a creature of unprecedented size, something the world had never contained before, something so immense that the mind struggles to find an edge to it. 1,000 arrows, Ovid writes. It takes 1,000 arrows to bring the python down. The detail is not meant to be taken as a precise inventory. It is meant to convey what kind of event this was. Not a hunt, not a skirmish, but something that required the full and sustained commitment of a god's power, applied without interruption until the task was complete. Ovid adds one further detail that quietly changes the register of the whole scene. He notes that before this moment, Apollo had used his bow only against deer and wild goats. This is the first great target his arrows have found. Whatever the silver bow was made for, whatever capacity it carried within its resting curve of metal, it had not been tested like this before, and the python is the thing that tests it, and the python falls. The wound marks in the creature's side catch the remaining light of the afternoon. The slope is still. The shadow of the python's body, enormous and unmoving, lies across the pale limestone like a second geological feature, as though something has been added to the mountain's topography that will take a long time to absorb. The arrows that remain visible in the creature's side are silver, and they catch what light remains in the low afternoon sky, and they are very still. The god is standing somewhere above, the bow now slack, the string fallen into its natural tension. He is not moving either. Something has been concluded, and the conclusion requires a moment before anything further can happen, before the landscape begins to reorganize itself around what it now contains. The tradition places the battle in the vicinity of Delphi itself, some versions setting it near the sacred chasm, others locating it in the broader landscape of Parnassus, the mountain's various slopes and terraces offering different grounds for the encounter depending on which version of the story is being told. What remains consistent across accounts is the essential geography. Apollo defeats the python on the serpent's own ground. This is not incidental. The god does not draw the creature away from the site and destroy it elsewhere, on neutral terrain or on territory already claimed. He comes to where the python is and meets it there, at the threshold of the oracle, at the entrance to the chasm that the serpent has been guarding since before the god's name was spoken in this part of the world. The battle is also, in this sense, a question, and the battle's outcome is the answer. Who holds this ground? Whose presence belongs here? What divine order this site will participate in going forward? These are the questions the arrows settle. It is worth sitting with what the Parnassian landscape would have looked like in the hours after the Pythus fell. The mountain does not change. The limestone cliffs above the sanctuary continue to catch the light in the late afternoon, throwing pale reflections down the slope toward the valley. The terraces of rock and thin soil continue to hold whatever scrub and low vegetation they have always held. The sacred chasm, if it is indeed nearby, continues to breathe its faint sweetness into the air of whatever chamber or hollow contains it. These things persist without adjustment. What has changed is the body on the slope, the immense and motionless form of the creature that was here before the god arrived, the creature that was born from the earth itself, according to the oldest accounts, or that arose from the great mud left behind after the flood of Deucalion receded, the primordial generative excess of a world still learning its own proportions. That creature is now still in a different way from the stillness of a resting guardian. The difference is permanent. The god declared that the earth would feed the serpent no more. Those words in the tradition's account are the first things spoken after the arrows find their mark. They are not a eulogy. They are not quite a taunt, though some translations have read them that way. They are something more like a statement of altered conditions, a description of the new state of things, spoken aloud on the slope where the new state of things has just been established. The python will not eat again. The earth will not sustain it. Whatever bond existed between this creature and the ground it guarded, whatever dark and ancient relationship connected the serpent's body to the chasm's breath, to the sacred fissure in the rock below, to the goddess Gaia, whose child, in the oldest telling, the python was, that bond is now severed, not forgotten, not undone in the sense of being erased from the record of things, but severed from the future. This mountain will go on, and the python will not go on with it. What happens to the body is in a particular sense the most enduring part of the story. The python is not buried. It is not burned or returned to the earth through any ritual of disposal. The body is left on the slopes of Parnassus to decompose in the open air over days and weeks and months in the sun and the weather of the mountain. This is the detail that generates the place name. The Homeric hymn draws an explicit connection between the rotting of the python's body and the ancient name for the site at Delphi, Pytho, the name by which the sanctuary was known before the later name Delphi became the dominant one. The hymn derives this name from pythesthai, a Greek verb meaning to rot, to decay, to return slowly and without ceremony to the substance of the earth. So the place name carries within it a memory, not of the battle, exactly, not of the arrows, or the god, or the moment of impact, but of what came after, the long, unglamorous, irreversible process by which the serpent's body re-entered the ground from which, in the myth's oldest telling, it had first emerged. The site is named for the decomposition. The sanctuary of Apollo occupies ground whose oldest surviving name describes the rotting of the creature, the god defeated there. This is one of those details in mythology that resist summary. It can only be held and considered the way the tradition holds it, without rushing toward what it means. Pytho. The word is a place, and the place is also a process, and the process is already underway on the slope outside the sanctuary, while everything else that this site will become is only just beginning. The months pass, as they do in the world the myth describes. The seasons move across the slope. The limestone cliffs above the sanctuary continue to catch the early morning light, and the Castalian spring continues to run cold through the gorge between the cliffs, its sound audible from a distance before the spring itself comes into view. The slope where the python fell is changing slowly, the body returning to the pale soil and the rock beneath it, the silver arrows, if they are still there, lying in the increasingly undifferentiated matter of what remains. The mountain goes on, being the mountain. The sacred ground goes on being sacred. The chasm in the earth of the innermost chamber still breathes its faint warmth into the still air above it, and the warmth still has no formal name, and the sight still waits for what it is about to become. The tradition does not linger on the slope. It moves, as traditions often do, to what happens next, to the further consequences that follow from the battle's completion, spreading outward from the moment of the python's fall, like rings across still water, reaching places and figures that seem at first unconnected to what happened on the slope above Delphi. Among those consequences is one that the tradition, particularly in Ovid's telling, places almost immediately after the python's death. Apollo, still on the slope, still with the slack bow in his hand, encounters Eros, the god of love, small, winged, carrying a bow of his own. Apollo speaks first. He speaks with the particular confidence of a god who has just accomplished something that has never been accomplished before, whose arrows have just proven themselves against the largest target they will ever find. He speaks, in Ovid's account, with something like contempt for the smaller bow and the smaller god who carries it. What work, he asks, does love have for a weapon? What is the bow of Eros compared to the bow of the god who has just brought down the python of Parnassus? Eros does not argue. He simply reaches into his quiver and draws two arrows that are unlike each other in every relevant way. One is gold, with a sharpened point, and it causes whoever it strikes to fall into a state of consuming, hopeless love. The other is blunt and tipped with lead, and it produces in its target a total and irreversible aversion, a turning away that cannot be undone by any subsequent event. Eros shoots Apollo with the gold one. He shoots Daphne, a river nymph, with the other. The myth that follows is not a comfortable one, and the tradition does not present it as comfortable. Apollo, struck by the golden arrow, is overtaken by a love for Daphne that has no relation to her own wishes in the matter, that is, in the myth's own terms, entirely a product of Eros's intervention, a state imposed from outside by a divine power, using the god of the silver bow as its vehicle. Daphne, struck by the lead arrow, wants none of what Apollo now wants. She runs. The god pursues. The pursuit is the story, and the story ends, or rather arrests, at the moment when Daphne, reaching the bank of her father's river and calling out to him for help, is transformed. The transformation is the part the tradition preserves most carefully, and it is the part that carries the most weight in the larger story of Apollo and Delphi. The skin becomes bark. The fingertips extend and divide, lengthening into branches that spread and subdivide in the posture of a figure still mid-flight, the movement of the running body arrested in wood. The feet enter the earth, the toes becoming roots that find the soil and the rock beneath it, anchoring in place something that was, only a moment before, in motion. The hair fans out and becomes leaves. The breath, if breath is the right word for what persists in the tree, continues to move in the slow, ongoing respiration of something that draws water from the ground and light from the sky and exhales through its leaves into the open air of the afternoon. She is still there, in the sense that the tree occupies the space she occupied. She is no longer there, in the sense that the figure who was running is gone, and what stands in her place operates by entirely different principles. Apollo stands at the bank of the river. The bow is still in his hand. The arrows have served their purpose on Parnassus. and now they are simply weight on his back, the quiver's quiet presence behind him. He does not loose another arrow. There is nothing to loose one at. What the myth holds in this moment is the image of the god beside the tree, his hand against the bark, the tradition says, feeling beneath it the heartbeat, or something like a heartbeat, the residual warmth of a living thing still present in the wood. He speaks to it. He tells it what it will be to him from now on. The laurel will be his tree, the tree whose leaves will crown victors, whose branches will be carried by priests and poets, whose presence in the sanctuary at Delphi will mark the sacred space of the oracle's ground. He cannot give back what has been taken. He gives what he can instead. The laurel tree stands at the bank of the river. Its leaves turn in whatever wind is moving along the water that afternoon. The small sound of leaf against leaf, barely audible beneath the sound of the current. The roots are already finding the soil in earnest. The bark is already settling into its permanent texture, the smooth grain of it, the way it will look in a year, and in 10 years, and in a century, largely the same, the particular quality of laurel bark that is neither smooth nor deeply furrowed, but something between those states, a surface that reads as quietly, permanently itself. The tree does not seem to be waiting for anything. It is already doing what a laurel tree does, which is to grow, which is to draw the water of the river through its root system and distribute it through the wood of its trunk and branches and eventually into its leaves, which is to exist in the open air of the afternoon, indifferent to everything around it that is not water, light, soil, and time. The god takes a branch. This is what the tradition records, that from the tree that was Daphne, Apollo took a branch, and the laurel became his, and the branch went with him wherever he went from that point forward. The sanctuary at Delphi would eventually grow a laurel within its sacred enclosure. The priests of the oracle would wear laurel crowns. The Pythia, the oracle's human voice, would carry a laurel branch into the atolm, the innermost chamber above the sacred chasm, when she prepared to receive and transmit the god's prophetic utterances. Victors at the Pythian Games, the festival established at Delphi in commemoration of the Python's defeat, would receive laurel wreaths as their prize. The tree that stands at the bank of the river in the myth becomes, through this sequence of connections, one of the most widely distributed sacred symbols of the ancient Greek world, present in the sanctuary, in the games, in the imagery of victory and poetry and divine favor. All of it rooted in the tradition's account, in this particular moment, at this particular riverbank, in the aftermath of a god being struck by a golden arrow on the day his silver ones brought down the Python. There is something in the structure of that sequence that the tradition seems not entirely unaware of. The battle on Parnassus and the transformation at the riverbank are not separate episodes, joined only by proximity. They are connected by the figure of the bow, by the specific fact that Apollo, carrying the instrument of long distance, precise, decisive force, encounters in Eros a different kind of bow, operating in a different register entirely, whose effects are no less precise and no less decisive, and which he cannot counter with his own arrows. The god who has just demonstrated the power of his weapon encounters a weapon he cannot match. The laurel is the result, the sacred tree that will mark the oracle's sanctuary and crown the oracle's victors, grows, in the tradition's account, from the specific place where Apollo's weapon could not protect him. The silver bow rests after the battle. Its string is slack. The metal is warm from use in a way that metal holds warmth, slowly, retaining it longer than other materials, releasing it gradually back into the air. The arrows that remain in the quiver on the god's back are undisturbed. They have not found targets today. They are still carrying their potential in their sharpened points, in the careful flight architecture of their feathered ends, in the tension of the bow that could be drawn again and then be still. The whole system of divine precision still available, still intact, still capable of whatever it has always been capable of. But the bow is slack now, and the god is standing at the bank of a river, and the tree is already doing the quiet work of becoming a tree. The slopes of Parnassus change across the weeks and months that follow the battle. The site where the python fell is not marked by anything the tradition records as a formal monument. There is no stone placed at the location, no altar erected over the body's remains. What there is instead is the slow, irreversible, geographical process of the python's body returning to the ground, the decomposition that gives the site its name, Pytho, the name that will persist for long enough that later ages will still be able to find it in ancient texts and inscriptions, even after the name Delphi has become the more familiar one. The slope is a kind of record. In this sense, not a monument, but a memory built into the very substance of the place, into the soil that absorbed the serpent's body, into the name that the tradition derived from the process of that absorption. The site holds the event differently than a stone marker would. It holds it in its etymology, in the linguistic memory carried by the place name through every generation that spoke it. Pytho, Delphi. The mountain above the site continues to rise, the limestone cliffs continuing to catch whatever light the sky provides, the Castalian spring continuing to run cold through its gorge, the path from the sea road to the sanctuary continuing to pass through the terraces of pale rock and thin vegetation that the mountain offers to anyone making the ascent. The sacred fissure in the earth of the innermost chamber continues to breathe its faint warmth into the still air above it. The chasm is unchanged. Whatever was rising from it before the battle still rises. Whatever made this ground sacred before Apollo arrived is still present in the ground, in the specific geological character of the site, in the thin sweetness that visitors described, in the air of the Adyme, in the particular quality of stillness that collects in a chamber cut into the rock of a mountain that has been considered sacred for longer than the records of any particular tradition can reach. The python guarded that ground. The python is gone. The ground remains. What comes next? What the tradition says Apollo built in the aftermath of the battle, how the oracle was formally established, how the god's priests were chosen and installed, what rituals were put in place to govern access to the sacred chasm and the prophetic voice that spoke from above it. All of that belongs to the period of construction that follows this one. It belongs to the patient, institutional work of turning a mythological victory into an enduring sanctuary. The battle is the event that precedes the institution. The arrows are what clear the ground for what comes after. But that is after. The battle itself is complete. The python has fallen on the slope of Parnassus, and the Homeric hymn has recorded it, and Ovid has given it 1,000 arrows and an account of unprecedented scale, and the place name Pytho has been derived from the rotting of the body in the open air of the mountain, and the god has stood at the bank of a river and watched a nymph become a tree, and has taken from that tree a branch, and the branch has become a sacred symbol carried forward through centuries of practice and commemoration. The slope is still, the bow is slack, the laurel tree is at the river bank, its roots in the soil, its leaves moving in the slow available wind. The afternoon on the slope above Delphi is very quiet. The limestone catches what light remains in the western sky, throwing a pale, indirect brightness across the terraces of rock below the cliffs, and the light is not golden, the way the tradition describes the light of Apollo's birth on Delos. It is the ordinary, specific light of a late afternoon in central Greece, the kind of light that is simply what the sky does at this hour when the clouds are thin and the air above the valley is still. The shadows of the loose stones on the slope are long and definite. The air is cool in the way that air at this elevation is cool by this hour, the heat of the day draining upward and away from the rock, the stone beginning to release what warmth it absorbed through the middle of the day. There is no wind on the slope itself. The terraces of the sanctuary, lower on the mountain, are quiet. The path from the sea road is empty in both directions. No pilgrim visible, making the ascent, no figure moving along the lower terraces from one structure to another. The sacred chasm in the innermost chamber of the temple, whose foundations are only beginning to take shape in the mind of a tradition that will spend the next several centuries building and rebuilding on this spot, breathes its faint warmth into the still air above it. The warmth rises in the way that warm air always rises, not visible, not dramatic, a simple physical consequence of the difference in temperature between the air rising from the chasm and the cool air of the chamber surrounding it. It has been doing this for a long time. It will do it for a long time more. The event that has just taken place on the slope above is, from the perspective of the chasm, simply part of the accumulating history of the site. One more thing that has happened here, on this particular ground, which has been the site of many things across a span of time that reaches back past the memory of any tradition currently claiming it. The body of the python is on the slope. It is very still and very large, and already the process has begun. The slow geological, indelible process of the serpent's return to the earth. The process that will give the site a name that will outlast the particular event that generated it. The silver arrows in the creature's side are still catching what light remains in the sky. They will catch less light as the afternoon progresses. They will catch less light each day that follows. Eventually, they will be absorbed into whatever the slope becomes as the body is absorbed into the soil, and the name and the ongoing quiet, undramatic fact of a sacred site that is now under new management, whose divine patron's name will be spoken here for centuries, whose oracular voice will address pilgrims from across the ancient world for as long as the tradition that sustains it persists. The laurel tree stands where Daphne was. Its leaves turn in a slow wind off the Gulf of Corinth. Far below, the water of the gulf flat and silver pale in the late afternoon light. The leaves catch that wind and move with it, the small continuous motion of a living thing responding to the available air, and then the wind passes, and the leaves settle, and the tree is still again, its roots in the soil, its bark smooth and permanent, the wood of its trunk and branches already doing the patient, unnarrated work of being a tree in the open air of a Greek afternoon, in a world where gods carry silver bows, and sacred serpents guard the breath of the earth, and a place name can carry within it the memory of a body returning slowly to the ground, and a branch taken from a tree that was once a running figure can become the symbol carried by priests and poets and the crowned heads of victors for longer than any of them will be able to count. The laurel tree stands. The leaves turn once more in the slow wind and settle and are still. The veil of Tempe opens like a held breath releasing after the exposed limestone of Parnassus, after the dry heat that collects in the hollows of the mountain and sits there through the afternoon. The valley arrives as a different world entirely, a narrow gorge cut deep through pale rock, the air inside it 10 degrees cooler than the plateau above. The Peneus River, audible before the valley itself opens fully. Its sound low and continuous, the kind of sound that has been there so long it has become part of the silence rather than a break in it. Laurel grows thickly along the river banks, its leaves narrow and dark, their smell carried on the cool air that moves off the water at this hour. Plane trees spread above the river, their bark pale and mottled, their canopies wide enough to filter the light down into something soft and even. Coming down from the mountain into Tempe is, in the oldest accounts of this tradition, something like arriving at a place the world has kept for exactly this kind of arrival. Apollo came here after the Python fell. The tradition is specific about this. Even for a god, perhaps especially for a god, certain acts required a passage through ceremony before the work of building could begin. The killing of the python, whatever else it accomplished, had left behind it something the Greeks called miasma, a state of ritual pollution that attached itself to the one who had taken a life and needed to be addressed before sacred activities could resume. The word carries connotations of contamination, but the concept is not quite what the English word suggests. It is less about guilt in the moral sense, and more about the disturbance left in the world when something is ended, a disruption in the order of things that must be carefully set right. Even a justified killing, even a killing that established a new and lasting order, still required its accounting. The tradition held that Apollo understood this, and so before he returned to Delphi, before he installed his priests, or laid down the practices that would govern the oracle for centuries, he came down from Parnassus and entered the vale of Tempe, and the valley received him. The purification he underwent here is described in ancient sources as involving both the waters of the Peneus and the gathering of laurel branches from the trees along its banks. The water ran cold from its sources in the mountains of Thessaly, clear over its pale riverbed, moving without hurry through the gorge. The laurel was already there, already growing as it had always grown, the tree that would become one of his most enduring sacred emblems, and here, at the beginning of the institution he was about to found, its first function was cleansing rather than crowning. He gathered it, he carried it back. The valley, by the time he left it, was already woven into the founding fabric of what Delphi would become. There is a festival that kept this journey alive for centuries. The Stepterion was celebrated at Delphi every 8 years, its timing part of a longer rhythm of Greek sacred calendars, its structure an enacted memory of what the tradition held Apollo himself had done. A young boy was chosen to represent the god, a boy of good family, the sources specify, both of whose parents had to be living, which was understood to mark him as unclouded by loss or ritual pollution. He did not travel alone. A procession accompanied him, moving through the landscape in silence, the participants neither speaking nor looking back as they went, which the ancient sources describe as a mourning behavior, an acknowledgement that what the festival was reenacting involved not only triumph, but transformation, not only a conquest, but a cost. The procession moved first through the sanctuary and past a structure, a hut or a shelter, built for this occasion, representing the dwelling of the Python on the slopes of Parnassus. It was destroyed as part of the ceremony. Then the procession moved onward, away from Delphi, along the road toward Thessaly, the young boy at its head. The journey to Tempe, undertaken on foot along ancient roads, took days. The procession arrived at the valley, gathered the sacred laurel, and then began the return. Coming back, the sources describe a different character to the movement. The silence lifted, the posture changed, the procession entering Delphi on its return as something that had undergone a transformation. The boy who had left representing a god in need of purification returned bearing laurel, which is to say bearing the sign that the purification was complete, that the god who had killed could now preside. Every 8 years, for as long as the festival was celebrated, this journey was made again. The road between Delphi and the Vale of Tempe was not a metaphorical distance, it was walked. What the Stepterion preserved across those centuries was not simply the memory of the Python's defeat. It was the understanding, embedded in the tradition from the beginning, that what happened at Delphi was not only a conquest, but a founding, that the space between the killing and the institution needed to be crossed deliberately, that it could not simply be stepped over. The gap was the point. The journey was the point. The laurel gathered in the valley was the point. The myth did not compress the founding of the oracle into a single dramatic moment. It distributed the founding across a sequence of acts, each one necessary, each one given its own time and space. The tradition held that this was how new sacred orders were properly established, not by force alone, but by the patient accumulation of ceremony. Apollo returned to Delphi, carrying the laurel, and the Homeric hymn to Apollo, which is the oldest and fullest ancient account of this founding, describes what happened next in a way that is, for an ancient cosmological text, surprisingly particular. He did not immediately install a Pythia. He did not immediately begin issuing oracles. He stood at the site he had claimed, on the slopes of Parnassus, above the Castalian spring, in the landscape of the sanctuary, and the first practical question was, who would serve here? The answer came from the sea. The Homeric hymn tells it this way: Apollo, in the form of a great dolphin, encountered a ship from Crete, sailing in the waters south of Greece. A trading vessel, its crew experienced sailors from Knossos, making for the port of Pylos on the Peloponnese with a cargo of goods and a specific ordinary commercial destination in mind. The god leaped onto the prow of the ship in his dolphin form, a detail so particular that it anchors the whole account in something almost mundane: a ship, a crew, a voyage, an animal that appeared on the prow and did not leave. The ship could not be steered away from its new course. The dolphin lay still on the prow, and the ship moved where the current and the wind and the presence of the god directed it, which was not toward Pylos. It turned north past Cape Malea, west along the southern coast, and finally came to shore at the bay below Crissa, the coastal settlement at the foot of Parnassus, from which the road climbed up through the olive groves to the sanctuary above. The men who came ashore did not know at first what had brought them here. The voyage had not been theirs to direct. They stood on a beach they had not intended to reach, looking up toward a mountain they had not intended to visit, with no cargo landed and no transaction completed, and no understanding of why the ship had come to rest in this particular place. Apollo revealed himself to them there, in his own form rather than the dolphin's, and told them what had happened and what would be required of them. They were to be his priests. They had been chosen not for any quality they had cultivated or sought, but simply because they were there, on that ship, on that particular morning, when the god was looking for the people who would begin his work. The hymn presents this without irony or apology. The Cretans had been going somewhere else. That was no longer where they were going. This episode, small and strange as it is within the larger narrative of Apollo's claiming of the oracle, carries within it a feature of the Delphic tradition that persisted through the entire history of the sanctuary. The Cretans brought with them a particular style of religious practice, particular methods of hymn and prayer and ceremony that became part of the foundation of Apolline worship at Delphi. The connection between Crete and Delphi was not incidental or invented after the fact. Archaeological and textual evidence Both suggest genuine early connections between Minoan and Mycenaean. Crete and the site on Parnassus, a thread of religious exchange running through the centuries. The hymn, by placing the first priests on a Cretan ship, preserves something of that older relationship in mythological form, encoding in the founding narrative the historical reality that what Apollo established at Delphi was not built from nothing, but assembled from existing materials, from Cretan practice, from the pre-Apolline worship already rooted at the site, from traditions of prophecy and sacred geography that were already ancient when the god arrived. The priests, once established, needed a sanctuary. They needed the material form that the sacred work would take place within and around. And among the most significant of the objects Apollo installed at Delphi, the most cosmologically particular was the omphalos. The omphalos was a stone, not a large stone by ordinary measures, roughly egg-shaped, perhaps a meter or so in its tallest dimension, its surface incised with a regular, net-like pattern of carved lines that ancient sources called the agranon, a word meaning something like a snare or a net. It sat on the floor of the sanctuary, in the innermost part of the temple precinct, and it was understood to mark the navel of the world, the precise geographic center of the earth, the point from which all distances in every direction were equivalent, the place where the world's own axis passed through its surface and continued inward. The claim was not metaphorical in the way a modern reader might assume. The ancient sources treated as a cosmological fact. The omphalos was not a symbol of the center. It was the center. It was the center. The means by which the center had been identified, according to the tradition, was characteristic of Zeus in his largest and most absolute mode of operation. He had released two eagles simultaneously from opposite ends of the earth, one from the furthest west, one from the furthest east, and the point above which they met in flight was the center. They met above Delphi. The tradition records this without apparent uncertainty. The eagles had made the geometry of the world visible, and the stone marked the place they had crossed, so that anyone standing before the omphalos was standing at the point that gave all other points their distances, the location from which the structure of the earth could be understood. Physical examples of the omphalos survive. Several ancient versions have been excavated or otherwise preserved, and they match what the ancient sources describe: smooth or lightly incised stone, rounded, the net pattern carved with care and regularity, the object clearly made for a specific ceremonial purpose, and made well. Ancient Greek coinage depicts it. Ancient travelers described it. Pilgrims came from across the Greek world and beyond to stand near it. The stone encoded in its physical form the most expansive claim the sanctuary made about itself, not merely that prophecy was available here, not merely that Apollo presided here, but that here was the center, and everything else in the world was positioned relative to this place. Alongside the omphalos, the laurel itself was present in the sanctuary, in forms beyond the branches carried back from Tempe. A laurel tree grew on the slope. Its roots found the thin limestone soil of Parnassus and went deeper into the rock, the way the roots of mountain trees do, not spreading wide above soft earth, but pressing narrow and patient through the cracks in the stone, finding water in the dark below. The tree grew without urgency and did not need to hurry. The slope of Parnassus was where it lived, and the years passed over it without accumulating in any form the tree registered or retained. It was simply there, as it had been there before most of the structures below it were built, and it would be there afterward, its leaves turning in whatever wind came off the Gulf of Corinth on any given afternoon, its existence one long quiet event of which no particular moment was more significant than any other. The laurel's connection to Apollo at Delphi runs through the story of Daphne, the nymph whose transformation into the tree, in Ovid's account, was the immediate consequence of Apollo's encounter with Eros after the Python's defeat. The god, still warm from the use of his silver bow, had mocked Eros's smaller weapon, and Eros had answered that mockery with a precision that a god of archery might have appreciated if he had been the one holding the bow. The golden arrow found Apollo. The leaden arrow found Daphne. What followed has the quality, in Ovid's telling, of two people moving in opposite directions with equal speed, Apollo toward her, Daphne away from him, the distance between them never quite closing, the pursuit carrying both of them across a landscape at a pace neither could sustain indefinitely. At the river Peneus, at the moment when the distance had finally closed, Daphne called on her father, the river god, to take from her the form that had made her vulnerable. The transformation happened at the moment of the god's arrival. The bark came up through the skin, the fingers lengthened, the hair became leaves, the arms branches, the feet roots pressed into the riverbank soil, and the movement that had carried her across the landscape all this while was stopped permanently in the form of a tree. He could not undo what had been done, because it had not been done by him, it had been done by the river god, by Daphne herself, by the appeal she had made to a different divine power. What the tradition could not now reverse, it transformed instead into devotion. Apollo declared the laurel his sacred tree. He wove its branches into a wreath and wore it. He made it the crown given at the Pythian games to those who had excelled in the contests, the athletes and the poets, and the musicians who competed under his aegis in the games that bore the Python's name. The laurel became the symbol of achievement and recognition in the Apolline tradition precisely because the tree carried within it the shape of someone who had chosen a different form rather than remain what she had been. The crown was woven from that. The Pythian games were the formal institution through which Apollo's founding of the sanctuary at Delphi was most widely felt across the Greek world. They were one of the four great Panhellenic festivals, gatherings that drew participants and spectators from the entirety of the Greek-speaking world, events at which the ordinary divisions between rival city-states were temporarily suspended in the name of shared religious observance. The other three Panhellenic festivals, at Olympia, at Isthmia, at Nemea, were associated with Zeus, Poseidon, and a hero respectively, and each was organized around athletic competition. The Pythian games were different in a way that distinguished them fundamentally from the others, and the distinction is one that the tradition connects directly to Apollo's own nature. At Delphi, alongside the running and the chariot races and the wrestling, there were contests in music and poetry. Competitors performed on the kithara, a large stringed instrument. They sang accompanied by the aulos, a double reed instrument. They composed and recited in verse. These were judged as seriously as any athletic event. The prizes were the same: laurel crowns, the acknowledgement of excellence, the fame that circulated afterward through the Greek world in poetry and story. The inclusion of artistic contests at the Pythian Games was not incidental. Apollo was, in the Greek tradition, the god of music and poetry, as much as he was the god of prophecy and archery. The full range of his domains, light, healing, prophecy, music, poetry, and the controlled application of lethal force at long distance, form a coherent picture of a particular kind of divine power. If the picture is held wide enough, the precision of the arrow and the precision of the musical phrase belong to the same sensibility. The clarity of the oracle's pronouncement and the clarity of the well-made line of verse belong to the same quality of mind. Apollo did not preside over unrelated things. He presided over a specific register of human excellence, the kind that required training, patience, and a willingness to submit the individual impulse to the demands of a form. The Pythian games were the quadrennial expression of that range, the gathering at which every kind of excellence the god valued was displayed and recognized together. The games were celebrated every 4 years, in the third year of each Olympiad, so that their rhythm interlocked with the Olympian cycle in a way that structured time across the broader Greek world. The site at Delphi was prepared for the influx of competitors and spectators. The sanctuary expanded and organized to accommodate the thousands who came from every part of the Greek-speaking world. The stadium where the athletic events took place was cut into the hillside above the main sanctuary, its rows of stone seating visible still in the landscape of the modern site. The theater, slightly lower on the slope, held the musical competitions, its curved stone tiers arranged so that every seat had a clear view of the performance space below. These structures were built over time, added to and rebuilt across several centuries, but the games themselves predate the stone buildings by a considerable period. The festival was old before the permanent infrastructure of the site caught up with its significance. From Delphi as a sanctuary, from the oracle, from the games, from the omphalos and the laurel tree and the sacred spring and the layered institutions that had accreted around the founding myth over centuries, there radiated a particular kind of authority that shaped Greek religious and political life in ways that went well beyond the immediate geography of Parnassus. Cities consulted the oracle before founding new colonies, before declaring wars, before establishing new religious practices. The answers they received were delivered by the Pythia, the priestess of Apollo, who sat on a tripod above the sacred chasm in the innermost chamber of the temple, breathing the pneuma that rose from the fissure in the earth, entering a state the sources describe as entheos, meaning filled with the god, speaking in a voice that was understood to be not entirely her own. The advice she offered was frequently ambiguous, and the tradition is full of accounts of consultants who heard what they expected to hear rather than what the oracle had actually said. But the ambiguity was not regarded as a flaw. It was understood as the nature of prophetic speech, language operating at the intersection of divine knowledge and human comprehension, where the precision of the god's understanding and the limitations of mortal language could only imperfectly align. The Pythia herself was always a woman, always a local woman from the Delphi region, always required to have led a life of ritual purity before her appointment. In the earliest period, the sources suggest she was a young virgin. In the later centuries of the oracle's operation, she was typically an older woman, still required to be ritually pure, but no longer required to be young. She bathed in the Castalian spring before each consultation. She chewed laurel leaves. She took her seat on the tripod. The questions came in from the antechamber, brought by the prophets, the male priests who mediated between the consulting parties and the Pythia herself. And the answers she gave were sometimes clear and sometimes required interpretation that the priests provided. The entire system was elaborate, carefully organized, and evidently effective enough to have been trusted by the entire Greek world for roughly 1,000 years. What the tradition holds about the oracle's authority is that it derived ultimately from Apollo himself, from the god who had claimed the site by defeating its guardian, who had purified himself in the valley to the north, who had returned bearing laurel and carrying the sacred stone and installing the first Cretan priests on the slope above the spring. The chain of authority ran from the god through the institutional structure he had founded, through the Pythia, who sat in the innermost chamber, and thirds include, and Coldicleaf and Falabro, and Tibus Everes well, through the priests who organized the consultations, through the answers that circulated outward into the Greek world, and became part of the political and religious landscape of entire cities and kingdoms. The omphalos at the center of the sanctuary marked not only the geographic center of the world, but the administrative center of a particular kind of divine communication, the place where human questions and divine knowledge were brought into proximity, where the gap between mortal not knowing and the god's fuller sight was, for a carefully managed moment, slightly narrowed. There is something worth resting on here, in the specific texture of what Delphi was in its mature form, not the violent founding, not the mythological drama of the serpent and the silver arrows, but the ordinary ongoing life of the sanctuary in the centuries when it was fully operational. Pilgrims arrived from the sea road to the south and from the mountain passes to the north, approaching along paths worn smooth by generations of previous visitors, carrying the questions they had been carrying for months or years, the questions that had not yielded to any ordinary resolution and had been brought here as a last or near last resort. They purified themselves at the Castalian spring. They waited. The spring ran cold out of the gorge between the Phaedriades cliffs, its sound constant and unvarying, the same sound it had made the previous day and the previous century, the water indifferent to the urgency of what it was being asked to cleanse. The pilgrims waited, and the days passed in the sanctuary at the ordinary pace of days, and eventually their consultation was organized, and they entered the temple precinct, and approached the innermost chamber, and heard whatever they heard, and went back the way they had come, with answers that were sometimes illuminating, and sometimes perplexing, and almost always, in some corner of their meaning, still open. The games returned every 4 years. The purification journey to Tempe was enacted every 8. The Pythia consulted on certain designated days, in certain designated months, with a regularity that organized the sacred calendar of the entire Greek world around the rhythms of this place on the slope of Parnassus. The laurel crown was placed on the heads of poets and musicians and athletes who had arrived here from distant cities and had briefly excelled in the sight of the god, and they went home wearing the evidence of it, and the fame spread further from that. The omphalos sat in the inner sanctuary, its incised surface gathering the dim light of the adaton, its meaning unchanged by the passage of time, its claim to mark the center of the world, neither more nor less credible than it had been when it was first placed here. The myth that founded all of this, the dolphin on the prow of the Cretan ship, the arrows loosing on the slope of Parnassus, the young god in the valley of Tempe, breaking a laurel branch from the tree by the river, that myth was told and retold across the entire period of the sanctuary's operation. The Homeric hymn to Apollo was composed sometime in the 7th century BCE, its hexameter lines carrying the story in the most formal and durable of ancient Greek literary forms. It was performed. Alphits are recited at festivals, possibly at the Pythian games themselves. Its account of the founding, given back to the place being founded, the myth rehearsed in the shadow of its own sacred consequences. The rhapsodes who performed it knew they were standing, when they performed it at Delphi, at the place the narrative described. The audience knew it. The omphalos was visible from where they stood, and yet the story did not require its setting to remain alive. It moved through the Greek world in the way that all the founding myths moved, in the repetition of the telling, in the images painted on the walls of temples, and on the surfaces of vases that circulated through trade routes to the edges of the Mediterranean, in the bronze and marble statues that stood in sanctuaries from the Aegean to the western colonies. Apollo with his silver bow, Apollo with his laurel crown, Apollo in his dolphin form, a mass of carved stone, somehow managing to convey the specific hydrodynamic grace of the leaping animal. Each image was an iteration of the same deep story, the same founding narrative, pressed into different materials by different hands across different generations, the core unchanged beneath all the variation. The laurel tree on the slope above the sanctuary grew through all of this. The roots pressed deeper into the limestone as the decades became centuries. The leaves turned in the wind off the gulf on warm afternoons, and on the afternoons when cloud came in from the west, and the temperature dropped, and the light off the Phaedriades became flat and gray rather than brilliant white. The tree did not distinguish these afternoons from each other. It did not distinguish the period of the games from the period between the games, or the year of the Stipterian procession from the years between them. The entire human activity of the sanctuary below it, the pilgrims, the priests, the athletes, the consultations, the omphalos in the inner chamber, the cold water of the Castalian spring, running its perpetual cold course through the gorge, all of it passed beneath the tree's quiet, unhurried attention, which was not attention in any sense the tree understood itself to be providing, but which the tradition attributed to it nonetheless, because the laurel was sacred to the god, and the god was present in the sanctuary, and the tree grew in the sanctuary's shadow, and these things were connected in the way that the tradition held all sacred things to be connected, not by argument or proof, but by the deep, patient fact of their continuous proximity. The Pythian games were celebrated for roughly 1,000 years. The oracle issued its answers for roughly the same span, perhaps lightly longer. The omphalos sat in the inner sanctuary through the Archaic period and the Classical period and the Hellenistic period, through the centuries when Delphi was one of the most important religious sites in the known world, through the Roman period when it continued to function under a different political dispensation, the god remaining in residence regardless of who administered the territory. The Stepterion procession made its way to Tempe and back every 8 years. The young boy, at the head of the procession, carrying the laurel home, the community of Delphi reenacting the founding of its own reason for being, the myth that explained what they were doing, and why walking the road alongside them in the form of the ceremony itself. What was built at Delphi, in the tradition's account, was not a monument to Apollo's victory over the Python. The victory was the precondition, not the point. What was built was a place where the question of what to do, how to proceed, where to turn, when ordinary knowledge failed, could be brought and addressed. The god who presided over it was a god of precision, of the arrow that finds its mark, of the line of verse that does precisely what it needs to do, and nothing else. That precision extended to the oracle. The answers were not vague because the god was indifferent. They were open because human situations are open, because the future is genuinely contingent, because the kind of knowledge a god might have about what will happen cannot be fully translated into the kind of language a mortal can act on without losing something essential in the process. The tradition held this not as a failure of the oracle, but as an accurate description of what prophetic knowledge is and does. The laurel tree knew none of this. It grew on the slope above the sanctuary, its roots in the limestone, its leaves moving in whatever wind came off the Gulf of Corinth on any given day. The slow, unhurried work of its existence proceeding without regard for the centuries accumulating around its base. The mountain held it. The thin soil held it. The rock beneath the soil held it.